The police kicked my front door off its hinges at exactly 1:47 in the morning. I stood barefoot amid the splintered wood and shattered glass. Across the lawn, my parents, Sandra and Robert, were smiling. My sister Jessica was recording a celebratory video for her followers, framing my arrest as a long overdue house cleaning of a criminal sibling. They expected me to scream, to beg, but I just held out my wrists for the handcuffs. This wasn't a breakdown. It was a balance sheet. Have you ever been blindsided by someone you trusted with your entire life? Let me know in the comments. I'm reading every single one. The ride to the precinct was a silent calculation. I didn't cry. I didn't ask the officers why I was in the back of their cruiser. Anger wasn't loud this time. It was clinical. At the station, the booking officer took my fingerprints with an air of routine boredom. But the moment he typed my name into the system, his monitor flashed a glaring, aggressive red. It wasn't a standard local alert. It was a federal security lockdown. The officer's boredom vanished. He pulled his hands away from the keyboard like it had burned him. Within 3 minutes, the atmosphere shifted entirely. The local fraud charges my family had fabricated evaporated into a much higher jurisdiction. I wasn't marched to a holding cell. I was escorted down a quiet corridor to a private interrogation room. 5 minutes later, the chief of police walked in. He set a glass of water on the metal table with deliberate, heavy movements. His eyes searched mine. Not with the casual indifference of a booking officer, but with the guarded tension of a man who suddenly realized he was out of his jurisdiction. I sat there, perfectly still, letting the reality of my situation solidify. I rubbed my eyes, trying to summon regret, but there was only clarity. My relationship with Sandra and Robert had never been maternal or paternal. It was a hostile takeover masked as parenting. Jessica was their golden asset, and I was the liability they kept around to absorb their deficits. Sitting in that cold room, I mentally audited my life. Every insult, every stolen credit, every manipulation was logged and categorized. For 27 years, my family had treated my existence as a debt I could never repay. I was the silent investor in their version of family, constantly paying dividends and loyalty while they siphoned my peace of mind. Growing up, I accepted their subtle cruelties. The invisible chain of the survivor is forged link by link, usually by the people who are supposed to protect you. You learn to interpret their abuse as love. You treat their demands like a contract you are obligated to fulfill. I used to think my survival depended on my compliance. Now I realize their affection had been a subscription, and I was finally footing the bill to cancel it permanently. The chief cleared his throat, trying to regain his authority. But I was the one in control. They thought they had framed me for embezzlement. They thought handing me over to local police would ruin my career as a forensic data analyst and secure their stolen fortune. But they weren't shocked by what they'd done. They were going to be shocked that I'd stopped playing along. The red alert on that precinct computer wasn't a mistake. It was the first domino in a meticulously engineered sequence. I hadn't just anticipated their betrayal. I had coded the exact parameters of their destruction. I took a slow sip of the water. My pulse was a steady, methodical drumbeat. The police department was confused, scrambling to understand why a local theft charge had triggered a federal mandate. I didn't offer any explanations. I just watched the clock on the wall tick toward 2 a.m. Everything was proceeding exactly according to the blueprint. To understand the trap they walked into, you have to look at the ledger from the beginning. It all started 3 months ago. During the reading of my great-grandmother Eleanor's $8 million trust, a complex portfolio of liquid assets and property that my family assumed was theirs for the taking. Eleanor was the only one who saw my family for the parasites they were. When she passed, the lawyers gathered us in a mahogany-paneled boardroom. Sandra, Robert, and Jessica sat with perfect posture, already spending the millions in their heads. Then Preston, their high-priced, morally bankrupt attorney, read the terms. Eleanor had bypassed them entirely. She left the bulk of the estate to me. I will never forget the look on my mother's face. It was the ultimate narcissistic injury. For a golden family built on the illusion of supremacy, losing the inheritance to the scapegoat wasn't just an insult. It was a psychological severing. They couldn't fathom that my quiet, calculated integrity had won Eleanor's trust. In their minds, they were entitled to the fortune simply by existing. My success as a data analyst, my independence, my bond with Eleanor. It all challenged the fragile narrative that they were superior. When the will was read, their inflated egos fractured. And in that fracture, their greed turned lethal. They didn't argue in the boardroom. They smiled tightly and offered me hollow congratulations. But I knew how to read their microexpressions. I knew the transaction they were quietly negotiating. They were going to take what they believed was rightfully theirs, and they were going to use my professional brilliance as the weapon. Because I managed complex financial algorithms for elite firms, framing me for embezzlement would look plausible to an outsider. They planned to drain the $8 million, funnel it into offshore accounts Preston had set up, and leave a digital trail pointing directly to my laptop. They spent weeks weaponizing my trust, asking for my help with minor financial transfers, and tricking me into leaving digital fingerprints on compromised files. I saw the discrepancies almost immediately. A forensic data analyst doesn't miss a misplaced decimal, let alone a fabricated routing number. I watched them orchestrate my ruin with a cold, detached fascination. This wasn't revenge. It was accounting. They wanted to balance their bruised egos by bankrupting my life, but they fundamentally misunderstood the person they were dealing with. They thought they were playing chess against a naive girl. They didn't realize I had already bought the board. I mapped out their narcissistic injury like a data set. Their need to dominate blinded them to the digital tripwires I was laying down. Jessica even had the audacity to ask me for a loan against the inheritance, a smokescreen to cover her tracks while Preston drafted the forged power of attorney. I smiled and told her I would review the portfolio. Every interaction was a calculated data entry, ensuring they dug their legal graves so deep they would never see daylight again. I didn't panic. I didn't confront them. I just opened my laptop and started building a counter-architecture. If they wanted a financial war, I was going to give them a federal one. I audited every forged document Preston drafted. I tracked every fake account Sandra and Robert authorized. I let them believe their hostile takeover was succeeding, right up until the moment they committed federal wire fraud. The escalation of their hostility required a flawless surveillance trap. Once I identified Preston's forged documents, I knew they would try to plant the physical evidence in my home. You don't execute an $8 million frame-up remotely. You need a smoking gun on the premises. So, I turned my home office into a digital fortress. I spent a weekend installing microscopic, motion-activated cameras in the vents, behind the bookshelves, and inside the smoke detectors. Every lens was angled to capture my desk and the safe where I kept my encrypted hard drives. I routed the feeds to a secure cloud server that only I could access. Then, I waited. I didn't have to wait long. For 3 weeks, I endured the unsettling reality of being stalked by my own blood. I noticed the subtle signs first. The displacement of a welcome mat, the slight realignment of my mail. They were probing my schedule, logging my movements. Then came the afternoon. I stayed late at the firm. My phone pinged with a silent proximity alert. I opened the live feed on my monitor. There was my sister, Jessica, using a copied key to enter my apartment. I watched the screen with clinical detachment. Jessica didn't hesitate. She moved through my home with the entitled arrogance of someone who believes consequences only apply to other people. She had used a key she'd kept since I moved in, justifying the intrusion with a forged emergency repair notice. Preston had drafted to give her a veneer of legal cover. She walked straight into my office and began rummaging through my desk. She bypassed the locked drawers and slipped a manila folder filled with Preston's fabricated bank statements into a stack of my legitimate work files. Then she opened my laptop, inserted a flash drive, and uploaded a batch of falsified transaction logs designed to look like I had been siphoning Eleanor's estate. I zoomed in on her face. There was no hesitation, no flicker of guilt. She was smiling, humming a pop song while she effectively signed away my freedom. That footage proved their total lack of remorse. It stripped away any lingering societal programming that whispered about family loyalty. Family doesn't plant federal evidence in your home. Family doesn't smile while burying you alive. Seeing Jessica's total lack of empathy greenlit my cold retaliation. I scrutinized the footage again, examining the angle of Jessica's wrist as she planted the drive. It was a business transaction, pure and simple. They were leveraging my freedom to secure their capital. Therefore, my response would be a ruthless market correction. I didn't shed a single tear for the sister who was actively framing me. Instead, I analyzed her movements to predict Preston's next legal filing. They were arrogant, banking on my blind trust. That arrogance was a critical vulnerability, an open port in their security firewall. I was ready to exploit it. I downloaded the high-definition footage, time-stamped it, and encrypted it into 3 separate digital vaults. I had the smoking gun, the motive, and the execution on tape, but I wasn't going to hand it over to local authorities. Local police could be swayed by Preston's expensive legal maneuvering. I needed a mechanism that would trigger an unstoppable, catastrophic sequence for them. I needed to let them pull the trigger themselves. So I left the manila folder exactly where Jessica had hidden it. I left the falsified logs on my hard drive. I went home that night, poured myself a glass of water, and sat at the desk she had just violated. I was completely unemotional. Anger requires energy, and I needed all my energy for the final calculation. To seal their fate, I had to lay down the digital breadcrumbs. I needed to ensure that when the hammer fell, it wouldn't just hit Sandra, Robert, and Jessica. It had to annihilate Preston's corrupt legal practice as well. I went into my office the next morning and met with my most trusted colleague, David. David was a senior forensic auditor with a clearance level high enough to access heavily guarded federal vaults. I didn't tell him everything, just enough to initiate a secure transfer. We spent 48 straight hours migrating the genuine $8 million from Eleanor's estate into an untouchable, federally monitored holding account. The real money was ghosted, protected by layers of biometric encryption and government oversight. With the actual assets secured, I returned to the decoy network. I crafted a series of dummy financial documents that perfectly mirrored the forged files Jessica had planted on my hard drive. I created phantom routing numbers, fake offshore holding companies, and a labyrinth of digital ledgers that looked like a masterclass in embezzlement. I knew their greed would force them to open these files. I laced them with a digital tripwire, a silent beacon that would turn their own attempt at theft into an immediate automatic confession sent directly to federal authorities. It was designed to do exactly one thing. The moment anyone attempted to officially submit those files into a state or federal registry, the beacon would activate. It would instantly transmit an automated, high-priority fraud alert directly to the Federal Bureau of Investigation, bundling the IP address, the user's credentials, and a complete forensic package of the planted evidence. The tension mounted over the next few days. It was a cold, silent waiting game. I went to work, drank my coffee, and operated with absolute precision. I treated every interaction with my parents like a final interview where I already knew they were failing. Sandra called to ask if I had sorted out Eleanor's paperwork. I kept my voice flat, telling her the accounts were in transition. I could practically hear the greed vibrating through the phone. I hung up and checked the server. I was waiting for them to play their hand. They needed to officially report me to the police to trigger the freeze on what they thought were my accounts. They needed to submit the evidence Preston had manufactured. I was essentially handing them a loaded weapon and waiting for them to look down the barrel. I checked the silent beacon's status on my secure dashboard. It was resting quietly in the metadata, a dormant predator waiting for a keystroke. The brilliance of the trap was its passivity. I didn't have to launch the attack. Preston's hubris would do the heavy lifting. He would file the documents, assuming he was securing a quiet local arrest. He had no idea his legal submission would act as a federal flare. I treated the impending betrayal like a scheduled software update. Everything was ready. The digital breadcrumbs were scattered, leading straight to the edge of a cliff. I reviewed the balance sheets one last time. Genuine assets, safe. Decoy assets, primed. Video surveillance, logged. The trap was flawless. I didn't pace the floors or bite my nails. I sat at my monitors, watching the data streams, entirely in control. I had orchestrated a scenario where their own greed would execute the final command. They thought they were the architects of my downfall, but they were just automated processes executing my script. The execution of the trap happened exactly at 1:45 in the morning. That was when Preston, operating from his upscale downtown office, finally uploaded the forged financial dossier to the local precinct's digital tip line, requesting an immediate emergency warrant. He thought he was being clever, filing in the dead of night to catch me off guard and expedite the asset freeze. He hit submit, uploading the very files Jessica had planted, along with the decoy documents I had laced with the tracking beacon. The moment those files hit the precinct server, the secondary twist activated. The tracking beacon didn't just ping the local police. It bypassed their local firewalls and sent a massive, encrypted data burst directly to the Cybercrimes Division. The beacon triggered a Level 1 federal red flag. It instantly flagged Preston's IP address, captured his digital signature, and matched the forged metadata to the high-definition surveillance footage of Jessica planting the drive. The local police received the warrant request, but before they could move, a federal override signal hit their terminal. The department was forced to stand down immediately, as the investigation had been placed under top-secret federal seal by the Cybercrimes Division. The federal agents took total jurisdictional control in a matter of milliseconds. When the police kicked my door down at 1:47, they were acting on Preston's local warrant. They had no idea they were walking into the middle of a federal sting. They were just the first responders to see the smoke. That's why the booking officer's screen turned bright red at the station. He wasn't logging a local embezzlement suspect. He was inadvertently accessing a locked federal profile. The chief of police wasn't trembling in the interrogation room because I was a criminal mastermind. He was trembling because the director of cybersecurity had just called his personal cell phone to inform him that his precinct was currently holding the key witness in a massive, multi-million-dollar federal conspiracy case. The federal agents arrived at the station 20 minutes later. 3 agents in dark suits walked into the private room. They didn't ask me questions. They didn't treat me like a suspect. The lead agent placed a secure laptop on the table and asked me to input my decryption key to unlock the surveillance footage. I didn't hesitate. I typed the sequence, hit enter, and watched the video of Jessica pop up on the screen. The agent nodded, closed the laptop, and told the chief to release me immediately. The kill shot had been delivered. My family's carefully constructed narrative shattered the moment that beacon pinged. Preston's upload was an irrevocable confession of federal wire fraud, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. They had forged documents to steal $8 million, and they had just handed the proof directly to the federal government. I walked out of the police precinct into the cool night air. I didn't look back. There was no panic, no lingering fear. I had executed the code flawlessly. My family had tried to bury me in a local jail cell, but they had just drafted their own federal indictments. The trap had snapped shut, and I held the only key. The final fall happened 48 hours later, during what was supposed to be their victory dinner. Sandra, Robert, Jessica, and Preston were gathered at my parents' luxury estate, drinking expensive champagne and celebrating my perceived destruction. Jessica was live streaming the dinner to her thousands of followers, boasting about a sudden, unexpected family windfall. She was smiling, holding up her crystal flute, utterly oblivious to the reality that her digital footprint had already condemned them. I watched the live stream from my laptop in a secure hotel room, my face a mask of absolute calm. At exactly 8:15, the heavy oak doors of the estate were breached. The live stream captured the precise moment the tactical raid began. Federal agents swarmed the dining room, their dark tactical gear a jarring contrast to the crystal chandeliers and silk tablecloths. Jessica's phone tumbled to the mahogany floor, the camera lens capturing Preston being thrown against the wall and handcuffed. Sandra was screaming, her voice shrill with disbelief, while Robert stood frozen in sheer terror. The live stream abruptly cut to black, but I didn't need to see the rest. I had already calculated the outcome. I watched the live stream go black, and I didn't feel a surge of malicious joy. I just felt the quiet satisfaction of a closed account. The justice of the planter is methodical. You tend to the roots, you calculate the yield, and you ruthlessly prune what threatens the harvest. My family had been a blight on my existence, draining my resources to fuel their vanity. Taking them down wasn't an act of vengeance. It was an act of extreme self-preservation. When the judge handed down their sentences, I didn't feel the need to be present in the courtroom. I had already received the confirmation from the federal prosecutor's office that justice was served. I didn't need to see them in handcuffs again. I had already moved on. The federal prosecutors didn't offer plea deals. The evidence was irrefutable, packaged and delivered by my silent beacon and the surveillance footage. Preston lost his law license immediately and was sentenced to 15 years for conspiracy and federal wire fraud. Sandra and Robert received 10 years each for their roles in the embezzlement scheme. Jessica, the golden child who had smiled while trying to ruin my life, was sentenced to 12 years for evidence tampering and grand larceny. Their luxury estate was seized by the federal government. Their social status, their carefully curated image, their entire world collapsed into absolute ruin. They weren't just disgraced. They were erased from the elite circles they had valued more than their own daughter. The $8 million inheritance remained safely in my control, completely untouched by their greedy hands. But the money was never the primary objective. This was about finalizing a balance sheet that had been in the red for 27 years. They tried to bury me, not realizing I was a seed. I took Eleanor's inheritance and used it to build a specialized cybersecurity firm. My company now designs the exact type of forensic traps and digital beacons I use to dismantle my family. We partner with federal agencies to protect vulnerable clients, the elderly, the scapegoats, the targets of financial abuse, from the very fraud I survived. I built an empire on the ashes of their deceit, turning their narcissistic injury into my professional foundation. Every time my firm secures a client's assets, I honor Eleanor's memory. I sit in my corner office today, looking out over the city skyline, and I feel a profound sense of clarity. I don't harbor anger anymore. Anger is a volatile asset, highly inefficient. I've come to realize that closure doesn't require an apology from the people who hurt you, nor does it require their understanding. Closure is an internal audit. It's the peace that comes from recognizing your own unshakable worth and refusing to let anyone devalue it. Forgiveness isn't always for the other person. Sometimes it's the only way to set yourself free. But forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, and it certainly doesn't mean allowing toxic investors back into your ledger. I severed the ties, and in doing so, I guaranteed my own prosperity. This is the reality of setting boundaries. If this story gave you the strength to stand up for yourself, share it with someone who needs it. Hit subscribe for more stories of justice served cold.